Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's Ask the Pet Food Pro. This series of chats is brought to you by Pet Food Forum and the editors of Pet Food Industry, the magazine and digital content provider that has been offering pet food expertise to the market for decades. You can find our content at petfoodindustry.com. Ask the Pet Food Pro offers a great opportunity to connect with industry experts and ask the questions that are top of mind while learning information to help you and your company provide high-quality pet food and treats. Today's chat is about upcycling, specifically using low-value proteins to create sustainable pet treats. It's supported by Ball Chem. Thanks very much to them. Our expert today is Dr. Charles Starkey, the professor in the Poultry Science Department at Auburn University. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you using the expert term very loosely in this sense.
Before we start the Q&A, I do have a few housekeeping notes. First of all, you've all been muted to ensure everyone can hear and focus on the discussion. So please submit your questions or comments in the chat box. Some of you submitted questions beforehand. We appreciate those, and we will try to get to as many as we can within the time allowed. And finally, this chat is being recorded. You can access the recording starting within a few days, maybe about a week, at petfoodforumevents.com and click on the Ask the Pet Food Pro tab. So let's provide some context for everyone, Charles, please. Can you please explain how you came to do some of the research you've done in this area? I mean, you're a poultry science professor and you've been doing research on pet treats. How did that come about?
Yeah, actually, my training's in animal science, and I worked in industry for almost 20 years prior to coming to Auburn. Swine, cattle, and poultry as well. And I also worked part of that time in the rendering industry and made a lot of contacts on the pet food side of things. And working with these poultry companies, there's a lot of co-products generated that typically go to rendering that we were looking at that had some higher potential as maybe a new protein stream for pet food or pet treats. Some of them are difficult to handle, and so we were trying to look at ways to improve the handling of some of those ingredients, make more money for the processors, both poultry, swine, and beef on the animal production side of things, but then also present some new unique proteins to the pet food industry that they could probably get at a lower cost and upcycle those, and both sides of the production and the pet food industry could reap better economic value off of those.
Okay, and we've had some technical questions come in, but just before we get into some of that, how has this been for your students? I mean, what has been their role? What do you think the benefits have been for them? You know, can you talk a little bit about that, please?
No. And I really appreciate that question. A big reason that we started this and decided to do this, we do a lot of physiology in our lab, and we're doing some molecular work that takes 6 months to a year to generate data. And with that, we had students that need to go present, they need to have abstracts, they need to be able to go and present and network at meetings. And the other thing we always try to do in our lab, we teach them how to do the live production techniques and animal management. We teach them how to do the laboratory techniques, but they also need to know about the food we're making for human use or for pet food. And so these projects gave us opportunities to train them in some food science areas. We're doing just very simple measurements. It's nothing new. There's a lot of people on the call know a lot more about texture and color and things than we do, but it exposes the students on some fun projects, makes them more well-rounded, and introduces them to different areas of the industry that have job opportunities that a lot of our students have never thought of.
Right. And the pet food industry, like a lot of industries, needs new people coming in. So that's a great opportunity for everyone. So can you describe a little bit more, going back to the actual research and the treats you've done, can you describe those a little bit more, what you've actually worked on and come up with, please?
Absolutely. We, there are markets for things for export things like wingtips, hearts, livers, kidneys. We've all seen the freeze-dried lung products in the pet food stores. There's getting to be some uniqueness out there in products. And so we were looking at products that were co-products coming from the processing stream, organs, wingtips, chicken paws that may not be graded high enough to be human edible, and some that may be because there's not always a market for those. And even catfish skins. Catfish is an important industry in Alabama. And so we're looking at these co-products and looking at ways to improve the economic value. Liver, for example, completely liquefies when you grind it. And so it can be very hard to manage and very hard to utilize. So what we did was we were looking for technologies to try to improve that. And we did that using, and we've been consistently using one hydrocolloid technology, and that's sodium alginate. There's a lot out there, the different gums and different products. And then also we're using an encapsulated calcium lactate to bind that product, trying to stay away from the wet water baths that can cause some issues with added moisture in the process for that calcium inclusion. So we really got into that, trying to think of ways to show people and get people communicating about the values that are out there. And where, there's shortages of fat on the market, there's shortages of protein, and we have those products, I think, well established. We just need to learn how to better utilize them, I believe.
Right. And I'm assuming that because of your work in the poultry area that I'm sure you're talking this up to poultry providers too, that this is an opportunity for them.
Yeah, absolutely. We've done several projects and we get products from our local facilities. We make we call them pet treats, and we go back and show them what we've done and what opportunities may be there for them and how we've done it.
Okay. Have you taken these to the point yet where, for example, we had a question about, are there AFCO naming considerations for this type of product?
Yeah, so I think initially I need to say that we're doing very, very initial early product development. We aren't adding the stabilizers and some other things that you would if you were fully developing a product. We just wanted to see if it, honestly, to be blunt and use lay terms, can we make stuff stick together? And we can. We got 40% liver into a product using heart muscle as the structure to provide structural integrity, and then the hydrocolloid makes them bond. And so we had very little leaching with that 40%. 20% worked great. But as far as AFCO, the organ meats, everything we're using really has been human grade thus far. We haven't even utilized downgraded paws in the product. We've utilized human grade paws so far. So as far as labeling, it can be called chicken. You can call it liver. You can call it heart. All that, to my knowledge and what I've looked up, would be approved through AFCO.
Okay, that's good to know. And we had a question come in about something like turkey heads. To your point about a human edible, that probably wouldn't work in this kind of development cycle, correct?
We're not looking at those at this moment because under AFCO regulations, that would be more of a byproduct raw material. So we really haven't gotten into that at this time. But one thing we need to remember, there's a lot of things that we don't introduce on the human food menu here, but in other countries, Europe and Africa and Asia, that we send a lot of product export. Organ meats and wingtips are used a lot. They generate a really beautiful broth when you cook them down. So there's a lot of these products that they are human grade. They are USDA approved and inspected. You would get the wingtips if you bought a whole chicken to cook, but when we cut them off to send the drumettes and the mid joints to a restaurant, we're left over with wingtips. So I think there may be opportunities for those down the road. It may not be compliant here. We'd have to look into that a little more, but it may be compliant for some export markets for pet food.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And in that vein, in terms of, the fact that things like this are eaten in other parts of the world, but not as much here in the US or in the Western world, have you looked at all or thought at all about, whether these would be quote unquote consumer friendly? So in other words, would these be negative? Do you think these would be negatively perceived by pet parents? Or would you think that would depend on the labeling and transparency of how they're made? Or
I think, there's a lot of information. We don't like chemical names on labels because
Right.
they're hard and confusing. But again, wingtips, you can put chicken. You can do, for paws, you can put chicken. They're the organ meats you can label as liver or heart or chicken. I don't know that there would be negative consumer perception toward what we're currently utilizing. And that's part of the reason we've tried to target those items. But,
okay.
We're also getting ready. We're just getting started. We've got a new sensory scientist here at Auburn, Dr. Sunjin Cho, who does some really fun work. And I've twisted her arm and talked her into helping us do some sensory. Initially, we'll do just some purchase intent based off the look of the final product, but our hopes are to go a little farther on consumer perceptions and things like that. And I think, labeling words is another way to do that and get the perceptions on that.
This is true. This is true. We just had a question come in. You were talking about valorizing the low value protein sources. Have you done any results on the digestibility of those?
We haven't to date. We can do that. But really, again, we've been in very initial work. But when you look at a product like wingtips and people think, oh, that's no good. Well, if you compare the at least chemical analysis of that, it's very good protein. It is high in collagen, which is usually digestible. So it compares pretty well against some of the other meat, like trim byproducts and things that we're currently using in pet food. Liver is great and a great store of nutrients overall,
Yes.
both vitamins and minerals and high in protein. So we have not gotten that far yet where we're doing digestibility work with these. It is something we've discussed down the road, but I don't see a big issue we're not using anything like feathers that have a disulfide bond and have to be processed in order to make them more highly digestible. Liver's very highly digestible on its own and used a lot for flavors and coatings in pet food.
This is true. That is true. So since you mentioned you haven't gotten that far in the testing, I'm assuming, or I'm asking, we had a question that had come in earlier about, the quality in terms of nutritional aspects. Have you looked at that at all?
One of the things we're learning a lot as we go, like I said, initially, I'm sure there's a lot of people on this on this webinar that are a lot more intelligent in some of these areas of food science than I am. But trying to get down to that water activity, there might be some concerns about Maillard reactions and binding of amino acids and reducing digestibility. In treats, we don't focus on nutrition as much as we would in a complete pet food. But we do think that there is potential, especially using dehydration versus cooking down, like we've used the Air Force convection oven in some cases dehydrate, and that's a lot harsher than using a traditional low temp dehydrator. And so we're doing some additional work on that right now as well.
Okay.
Not so we don't damage the nutrients.
Right. What about the ash and mineral content? Have you looked at that at all?
We have a little bit on the wingtips. It's actually not as bad as some people might believe. We're using these wingtip products with the two very small bones intact. But when they're taken from a small bird, they haven't fully calcified and mineralized yet. And so we see a lot of breaks of wingtips in a processing plant because the bone is not strong at this, at that age. So the roaster chickens that we buy at the grocery store and take home for our family, those wingtips are still not fully mineralized. So the highest nutrient based on CI analysis is basically protein. And fairly high in fat.
Okay. This kind of goes back, this is a question that just came in that kind of goes back to the whole labeling aspect, where the person's saying, is this really low value protein that's upcycled if it's already human food grade?
It is, in the sense that it's being cut off or removed at the plant, at the processing plant, and sent to rendering, where we're talking 3 to 6 cents a pound in many cases. We're adding a little bit, and we've got a paper on the economics of this coming out. We did a poster last year at the Pet Food Forum. We're adding some dollars in processing and with the hydrocolloid ingredients, but the generation of the revenue is tremendous. And pet treats, a low price per pound for pet treats would be $7 a pound. So we're comparing that to, let's just say, 5 cents a pound on the rendering side. So economically, that is a huge uplift with just a little bit, a couple of dollars in process and packaging added.
Okay, right. I mean, the upcycling is a fairly new term anyway that I don't think anyone has really defined. Not that, there's terms that have been around forever, like natural, that aren't completely defined for everyone. But yeah, that's I can see why upcycling makes sense in this case. We had some questions come in, and just another one now about other types of proteins. So you've done this with chicken and poultry. So what about other low value types of things? Have you looked at anything else?
We have. So we're also looking at organ meats from both swine and beef cattle, lungs, kidneys, liver, heart, that aren't, there is an export market, but it may not be as robust as we'd like many times. Again, catfish is a big industry in the Southeast, and we just recently validated, people have seen a lot of catfish skin products for cat treats on the market already. The catfish skins work really well for that. And again, to date, they're 100% being rendered, which is good and sustainable. I don't have a problem with that, making fish meal, but if we can get more value out of it, let's try to do that.
Sure, I agree. Let me see what other questions we have. And I'm assuming that the treats and again, I know this is early development stuff, but they probably are more applicable to dogs than cats. Like you just talked about the catfish skins, that would obviously be cat friendly too, but the wingtips and things like that are probably more dog oriented, I'm assuming.
The way we're making them now, maybe, but I think there's some things we could do, especially with some of the liver incorporation, and make a better treat. We might have to end up more with a semi-moist final product on that, but I don't see any reason. Cats like birds, and so the chicken should work quite well for that. There's a lot of chicken used in a lot of the cat foods we see today.
This is true. What about fresh foods? Are you aware of any co-product type of things that are similar to what you're talking about for these treats that you're trying to stick together? I mean, are you aware of any used in fresh pet foods?
I mean, the liver's a big go-to, and liver's kind of funny because, like, right now or just recently, I talked with someone from the poultry industry on the sales side. Liver was high, can't get enough of it, and then you'll go in a downturn and they don't even pull them off the birds. They just send them to rendering because there's not a valuable market at that moment for those. But liver's a good one. And with this, with using some gums or other hydrocolloids, like the sodium alginate we're using, you can bind a lot more liver. 20% shouldn't give you any issue at all using the FDA standard that's what we've seen using the FDA standard for the sodium alginate. So I think there's a lot of these organ meats that they're a little bit challenging to handle and process because they liquefy. But I think there's a lot of opportunity in some of the fresh pet foods for those.
Okay. Do you know of any specific examples that you've seen them in finished products?
Well, we've been doing the stuff with the liver and heart, and we just completed a project. The data's not completely done yet, but we did make a full pet diet. And so we're going to see how that turns out and try to do a complete and balance. But we incorporated 20% liver into that. There was no leaching. There was no issues with texture or color. We get normal, degradation like you would with any fresh pet food on color. Best colors on day 0, but it holds really stable after that. It drops, but it holds stable from day 3 to day 10 on that product. So we do have that color data back, but there's some additional data on texture and stuff we don't have at the moment.
Okay. Let's switch gears a little bit. You mentioned sustainability a few minutes ago. Have you done, in terms of the research you've done so far, have you done any sort of, computation scores or life cycle analysis or any other kind of way to measure if you're, capturing more value from these low value proteins?
Yeah, and we haven't done that. We need to. There's some excellent data on the sustainability of rendered meals, and I think the industry as a whole understands the importance of rendering or reutilizing these products. I think in this case, we would have to pull some of these individual ingredients out of some of that data, but the recycling, reuse, repurposing still applies. We're just doing it more instead of cooking it down into a meal. We're doing it more on what would be a fresh type product, or a lot of what we're doing, we're dehydrating into like a jerky style treat.
Okay. So that's still a message, though, that I would think you can be proven at some point to resonate with consumers, because as we all know, consumers are paying a lot more attention to sustainability these days. So what about using any of these co-products in human foods? Is that happening? Do you know if it's being looked at?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. We have discussed some of that potential. Again, a lot of the organ meats are eaten readily all over the world. We grew up, some people on the call probably grew up eating liver. I know we had it, maybe every few months at my home growing up. Can't say I was a huge fan of it, but we see less and less of that. So I think a lot of these things could potentially be transformed. The products we're making, if you look at Epic type jerky products and the meat sticks, and I was at Super Zoo last year and saw a display stand with meat sticks and jerky that were almost identically packaged and labeled to the Epic products, and they're all for dogs. And so I think there's potential. There's a lot of new products on the market that are human or dog edible. They could go either way. So as long as we continue using these inspected products that are labeled for human food use, there shouldn't be any issue in that. And then I think there's maybe another step that could be interesting down the road. Can we deliver nutrients to certain peoples that are in these starvation deserts or zones, and deliver some specific nutrients to those individuals in maybe a dehydrated form? If the nutrients, we can keep them stable, and it's something that's easier to ship and package and deliver at that time. You know, liver's a great nutrient source for fat soluble vitamins, but how do we get that intact to certain populations can be a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting aspect of it. Just had a question come in about the liver aspect that you've been talking about. Would the high vitamin A levels be a limiting factor for applicability
For what?
for applying the liver?
I
With
don't.
the,
It shouldn't. I'd have to go look at that. Like in a complete pet diet, we're not talking about, you know, a whole loaf or anything being made just from the liver. In the treat side, you know, we want to be concerned about nutrients, but it's not as demanding as long as they're fed it with the intended purpose. So I don't know that vitamin A, it takes quite a bit of vitamin A to cause a toxicity issue. I think it'd be pretty challenging, you know, and it has to be absorbed by the animal as well. So I think it'd be pretty challenging to reach that type of level.
okay. Back to the whole upcycling and aspect of this. There's an association, the Upcycled Food Association. Have you looked into, you know, that what they consider upcycled foods and registering something like this with them?
I have not. You know, again, we're not making final product here. We're just trying to do really early development and share that with people, both on the processing end and the pet food and pet treat side. So I have not looked into that at this time.
Okay. What about the supply chain? We've talked about, you know, your work with, you know, interactions with some poultry suppliers. You know, are there any certain complexities in terms of the types of products you've been working with, you know, storage requirements, you know, temperature, shelf life, packaging, things like that? And what kind of considerations do people need to know about in terms of the chain?
Yeah, I think all of this has to be refrigerated, just like or could be used frozen. A lot of our product we freeze and then do the process later, but it would need to be under cold temp storage, just like any human food product, at least until you get the water activity down low enough that it's stable on its own. But as far as logistics, there's a lot of processing plants in poultry. If they have orders for liver, they put individuals there and they remove the chicken livers and they process those for human consumption today. If they don't have orders, it usually just goes with everything else to rendering. Same thing for wing tips. They're cutting those off to send the other two portions of the wing to restaurants. They can easily collect those wing tips. We go get whole combos of wing tips to do our project. So I don't think the logistics for my friends from the poultry industry, if you want to buy it, they'll figure out how to get it to you. I can promise you that.
Good. That's good. Well, we've talked a lot about, you know, low value protein and other sources that might be available for this type of product of you know, upcycling. If you're comfortable with this, let's shift gears a little bit to, you know, there's an ever-growing need for protein for both humans and pets. You know, have you looked into other alternative proteins? We get a lot of questions about insect protein, for example. And that's not an upcycling issue, really. It's although foods can be upcycled to feed the insects. But you know, do you have any comments or thoughts on other sources of protein outside of the upcycled low value ones?
Well, I think currently part of the question we're asking ourselves, you know, we want pet food, consumers want pet food to be more like their food. And so we're taking some higher value choice cuts and incorporating those into pet diets now. And they work really well. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think we could take things like the heart and liver, possibly kidneys, some of these other co-products, and they'll work just as well. We've also used whole carcass frames from chickens that are left after deboning. Again, there's a good bit of bone in that, but again, it's not mineralized that readily if you take it from the smaller, younger birds. So can that be incorporated into human protein streams? I believe it can. That hasn't been our goal yet to date with any of this work, but protein and amino acid nutrition, I mean, my background's in nutrition, and you need the amino acids and you need a certain level of protein, and it really doesn't matter where it comes from if it's digestible. I'm very excited to look at the insects. I've got some superworms and crickets in the freezer right now that we're about to get into. And then one of our master students going to also look at some plant proteins and some potential combinations with some of these animal proteins that we've been working with already.
Okay, good. Yeah. Yeah, plant proteins are very popular too. And for people, if people on the call have been asking about insect proteins, not to take away from today's discussion at all, but we probably will be doing one of these on insect protein next year. So back to the chicken and the poultry parts, and some things you were just talking about that could still be explored. I've had a question coming about any upcycled use for chicken blood.
I think it's possible. Part of the reason we don't process poultry blood currently the same way we do porcine, the cells lyse very easily. The chicken blood cells are a little different than what we see in mammals, and so they lyse and they start to decay rather rapidly. So really, the current way that blood is handled is it goes to its own separate tanker and gets dehydrated and usually added back to one of the meals, feather meal or one of the other meals. I think there's some potential with a little innovation if we get it stabilized early. I mean, there's definitely nutrients there available that can be utilized by animals, pets or otherwise. I just don't think we've been innovative enough yet to really take that all the way out to market at this time.
Would that be considered food, human food edible?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I've never looked into that, so I'm not sure that it would. I think the way it's designated right now, it would not. I think there would have to be some additions to. It would have to be inspected in some form, and currently it's not. So it may be possible through USDA inspection, but if it is, I'm not aware of it at this time. But I also haven't looked into it yet.
Okay, fair enough. And also, I'm assuming that would also be one of those areas where would take some education to convince consumers that they should be ingesting any kind of blood. So, and maybe for their pets too. So you talked about how easily you can get, for example, wingtips, for your research. We all know that there have been supply chain issues. You've touched on that definitely too. Are there quantities available of all of these products for testing for other people to test with? And even to move into production at some point?
I think so. I mean, the quantities from the chicken industry standpoint, they want to put everything in the human food or as high an economic value product as they can. And so what we're currently utilizing in the meals is not a whole lot remaining of the bird. And so I think if we can take these products that, through debone that we're getting that are currently going into rendering, I think the supply chain level of these type of products would be a lot bigger than we imagined. I haven't done a calculation on that. Now, wingtips are, I recall off the top of my head, at roughly 1 to 1.5% of the entire weight of a poultry, a whole bird that's processed for humans. That's not a tremendous amount, but we also raise 9 billion of those in this country. Right. So even though it's small, it adds up. Can it be utilized by every manufacturer out there? More than likely not, but I also know that it's an attractive alternative for every manufacturer at this time.
This is probably true. This is probably true. Well, you've talked a lot about some of the technologies that you're using and that you think could also be used. We had a couple of questions that wanted to explore that a little bit further. Are there other technologies out there that could be considered to improve, handling and manufacturing, functionality, things like that?
I think so. Like I said, we've just been doing very, very basic. Can we get these proteins to bind? And there's a lot of hydrocolloids, and some of them will be more effective with different proteins. That's part of the project with the master student, looking at the plant proteins versus some of our animal products, is which hydrocolloid do we get a better bond and linking from to make a more stable, resilient product. So that's some work we have coming up. Other technology, we have to get inventive. Grinding technologies and things like that. We may have to use more non-traditional methods to process these materials. But I think that there's a lot, if you liquefy liver and that has to be handled differently because it's in liquid form when you add it. Things like that are going to be, but I think those challenges can be overcome. We're doing a lot of, it's all small scale at this time. But if you ground liver, you pumped it in a tank, you had a pump, and then you inject it into your product as desired while you're mixing the hydrocolloids and stuff in. I don't really foresee a problem with that. Again, liver, at least poultry liver, may not be the best option. Mammalian liver at times seems to have a lower price and a pretty large volume. But I think these things can all be overcome with a little ingenuity.
Okay. And the current things you're using, like the hydrocolloids, those are obviously APCO compliant, right?
Yeah, yeah. And there's a whole lot of different ones. We've really just been we've been fortunate. The Tilly company has been really, really good to our program and supporting the students' learning. And we're using the product from them currently. But again, there's all kinds of different hydrocolloids, and they're going to work differently with different, all these proteins have different functionality. The catfish skin, we just validated that last week, and that the texture and the functionality of the proteins found there are going to be quite different than what we're seeing from a heart or a kidney or some other organ.
Right. And I know you're using some of Balchem's products too, correct?
Yeah. So Balchem's, they have an encapsulated calcium lactate that we are using to supply the ions to help form these bonds with the hydrocolloid.
Okay. What about, we just had a question, what about the gizzard? Is that harvested separately, and where does it normally go? Does it have potential for use in pet treats?
I think so. A lot of it goes to human consumption. A lot of gizzards are harvested. So I'd have to go get some pricing. I'm not sure that it's something we could really reap a lot of additional economic value off of. They do go for human consumption. Even some, we eat fried gizzards here in the South, but a lot of export. And so they are harvested and cleaned, and that would be a very interesting. That's a very rigid structural muscle, would be probably somewhat in functionality more similar to the heart muscle because of the rigidness. But if you could get hold of it, there should not be any reason. I mean, they go for human consumption now, so there's no reason I could see why they couldn't be utilized.
Right. Yeah, I grew up in a household too where if we cooked a bird, someone, usually my dad, ate the liver, gizzard, and heart. Not most of the rest of us didn't, but someone did. So I think this is a question that we may have addressed earlier, but we'll maybe go into a little bit more depth. And what is your perspective on how to properly message the value of these upcycled protein ingredients to speak to the sustainability message but also put consumers at ease in terms of their quality and nutrition?
Well, you know, we're talking about products that are typically, if you look at a complete pet food, they have to be mixed just like any other animal protein, whether it's chicken breast trim that you're using or wingtip, you have to formulate that diet correctly for the stage and age of growth and all that. The sustainability is very good, and again, these are products that are currently going to rendering, which is very sustainable as an industry. We're just trying to take them out of the stream a little sooner instead of dehydrating them and incorporating them with other proteins in the meal that are acceptable. These might be items we can pull out a little earlier in the stream, incorporate them into more semi-moist or fresh type products, since they are human grade, and get more value out of them than the rendering side.
Right. And I know that the Renderers Association and others have, been trying to make the case on the sustainability side with consumers too. And that's, it's just something that I think it takes a lot of additional work. There's just been some demonization of quote unquote byproducts that, that's a hard row to hoe, but I think there's movement there, and maybe that can be built upon. You mentioned some data and some publishing that's happening. So just to clarify, have you had anything published yet that you and your students have done, and where would people find that if so?
So far, we've got one article published. It's a journal called Animals. We've got several others, but we've had numerous presentations at Poultry Science, the International Poultry Scientific Forum, which is at IPPE, that precedes the trade show every year.
Mhm.
We took a few abstracts to your meeting at Pet Food Forum last year.
Correct.
Meat science and animal science, we presented that as well. So there's a lot of abstracts out there. We can get a hold of those and share those with people, but those are currently being incorporated into journal articles. What we've been doing, again, very early product development. We're not saying we're doing anything with an end ready to market product, but for all of these tests, we're taking color measurements over time. We're looking for changes in color, initially with the different blends that we're using and how they compare. We're doing texture analysis on all these treats, and then just some very simple food chemistry, water activity, pH, things like that. So all that data is being compiled and currently being prepared for manuscripts for scientific journal.
Okay. Someone asked if we can list where to find these. We will try to do that when we post the recording to Alice. Thank you for asking that question. So Charles, I'll follow up with you to get some of the context, and of course we do Pet Performance, so we can provide that too. Back to a question about the poultry meat itself. Would it still be able to get specified and claimed in some such certifications, such as organic or free run, or a lot of the buzzwords that are happening now in the poultry space for humans? So would these upcycled parts of the bird be able to fall under those kinds of certifications?
I don't know that I have a correct answer on that today, because it's not something I've discussed or looked into. But if you take these parts and they are human edible from a free range bird or from an organically fed bird, I wouldn't see necessarily a reason why not, because they are, again, we're using things that qualify as human edible, at least to date.
They would just have to be certified that they were processed separately from, for example, non-organic, or right?
Correct. They would have to be sourced from an organic flock or a free range type flock at the time of processing.
Okay. All right. I think we're almost out of questions, but we do have a couple that are kind of plugs, and we'll just go from. So if someone were to want to do a test with you, would they, can they contact you directly, for example?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We're trying to teach students and expose them to different sides of the industry to make them more well-rounded. It's one thing to be able to walk through a chicken barn and look at chickens, but you need to know what you're producing. And it's not just human food you're producing. You're producing a lot of pet food. And the pet food industry has a ton of opportunities for students upon graduation. And we really look and like that, being able to interact and network with our students in the industry and hopefully find some good marriages there.
Okay, so for the person who asked that, we will make sure that we get you Dr. Charles' contact information. And then finally, speaking of your students, so if a student, if someone knows of a student, looking to select a program or looking to, how would they follow up with you? Is it, again, just give your contact information if we come across someone like that?
Yeah, and there's the thing about pet food is everybody, I guess I'm just repeating what everybody on the call already knows. Greg Aldridge has a great program at Kansas State. There's some really good work coming out of Guelph, Illinois, with Dr. Swanson's building a lot of good stuff, and they have a new hire there. We're I think doing it a little differently. Our tactics a little different. We're looking more at that marriage between the two industries, but I think there's so few programs out there that if a student has an interest, I would encourage them to contact all those individuals and see where the best fit is for them. But we'd be happy to speak to any students that had an interest.
Yes, there are far too few of you, and the more we can get, the better. So hopefully that'll happen. Well, thanks, Charles, very much for today's discussion and for sharing your insights. Thanks again to Balchem for their support. We really appreciate it. To learn about other pet food industry topics, such as insect protein, other types of proteins, you can watch for more Ask the Pet Food Pros we have coming later this year and next year, as well as our pet food industry webinars. We'd also like to encourage you to please save the date for next year's Pet Food Forum. It's there on the screen, and that will have topics on a lot of important sessions on a lot of important topics. We would greatly appreciate your feedback on today's chat to help us improve future ones. So if you can please scan the QR code on screen. We also will be sending up a follow-up email with a link. And finally, just a reminder that this is being recorded, and the recording will be available in about a week at petfoodforumevents.com under the Ask the Pro tab. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day or evening. Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you.